Snow fell relentlessly across the barren landscape as the transport truck groaned to a halt. The prisoners' breaths formed clouds that vanished into the icy wind, carrying with them the scent of fear and frost. Towering walls of stone rose ahead, black against the winter sky, crowned with barbed wire that gleamed like frozen fangs. No one spoke. Each man knew stories whispered in secrecy, tales of those who entered this place and were never seen again. They called it the Frozen Fortress, a name that clutched at hearts with a cold hand. The gates opened with a deafening creak and the guards barked commands that were half shouts, half growls.
We have to move tonight.
The prisoners shuffled forward, boots crunching over snow hardened by countless footsteps. Inside, the fortress breathed a cold silence that was heavier than the wind outside. The walls themselves seemed alive, absorbing whispers, groans, and the faint echo of chains. One man stumbled, nearly collapsing, and a guard's rifle pressed against his back reminded him that mercy did not exist here. As they were herded into the main yard, the prisoners glimpsed the towers rising above, windows like hollow eyes staring down with judgment. Beyond them lay barracks, cells, and punishment chambers carved into the stone like tombs. Each man carried a story, a crime real or imagined, but none would survive by telling it. The air was thick with the scent of frozen earth, sweat, and despair, mingling into a perfume of hopelessness. The first night was the harshest. The guards left the prisoners to huddle together for warmth in spaces too small to hold hope. Whispers of previous arrivals echoed in their minds, some claiming they had seen shadows move with sinister intent, figures of those who had been broken long ago. Sleep came in brief shivers, interrupted by the wind that moaned through the fortress walls.
Silence.
Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled, though no one had struck
Do not break ranks.
and it seemed to measure their punishment in frozen heartbeats. Here began the story of the men who dared to breathe in a place where every breath belonged to the fortress. Here in the coldest shadow of human cruelty, survival was a rebellion. The first night was not about hunger or frostbite. It was about understanding that the frozen fortress did not just imprison the body, it imprisoned the soul. By morning, the yard had hardened under frost and the prisoners were marched to the inner cells. Each step crunched like the final warning of a life already borrowed. The fortress revealed itself not only as a physical prison, but as a machine designed to break human will. Towers loomed like watchful sentinels, guards moved with mechanical precision, and the walls absorbed the light of day, returning it as cold shadows. Inside, cells were stacked one atop another, narrow and devoid of comfort. Wooden floors warped and splintered, metal beds frozen stiff under the weight of misery. Prisoners huddled together, sharing the little warmth they could steal from one another, eyes flicking nervously at the guards who patrolled with eyes like hawks. Whispers told of men who had attempted escape only to be found mutilated, frozen solid against the outer walls, a warning carved in the snow. The fortress had its own rhythm, a pulse that seemed to track each heartbeat. Chains rattled without cause, doors opened and closed as if by unseen hands, and the wind carried voices, sometimes pleading, sometimes commanding. Guards claimed it was imagination. Prisoners knew it was memory. Every brick, every beam, every iron bar carried stories of cruelty, despair, and occasional bravery. Meals were scarce, water freezing before it reached lips. Hunger gnawed with relentless insistence, but fear was a sharper edge. Punishments were public and ritualistic. Men who defied orders vanished for days, their absence explained by silence. Others returned broken, their faces frozen in expressions of horror too deep to describe. The fortress had perfected terror, turning it into a language understood by all, leaving none ignorant of its power. At night, prisoners whispered of the fortress's hidden chambers, where those deemed most dangerous were kept in solitary cells carved directly from ice and stone. Few knew what went on inside, but rumors told of men who endured endless darkness, their minds cracking as frost formed over their eyelashes. Some claimed to have heard the wailing of those lost within, a sound that could freeze even the bravest heart. Survival here was an act of defiance against the very machinery of oppression. Among the prisoners were men whose names had traveled through whispers of fear and fascination. Some were political dissidents, others spies or criminals, and a few were simply unlucky enough to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. These were men who had dared defy regimes, speak truths, or steal secrets, and the fortress had been designed to contain them. Each arrival added to the legend of the frozen fortress. New prisoners were introduced to a system designed for one purpose: to erase their identity. They were stripped of names, belongings, and dignity. Guards monitored every movement, every word, every flicker of emotion. Any hint of rebellion or hope was met with immediate punishment. Some were sent to the ice cells where temperatures dropped so low that breath crystallized in midair. Time here became meaningless. Days blurred into nights and weeks into months. Yet even in this harsh environment, some prisoners displayed remarkable cunning. Secret messages were passed through food trays or carved into walls with stolen nails. Alliances were formed quietly, small acts of rebellion that kept their spirits alive. Among the infamous inmates was a man who had once led a daring escape in another camp. His presence inspired whispers of hope, though any misstep could cost life and sanity. Stories spread among the prisoners of those who had attempted the impossible, digging tunnels under frozen soil, hiding in snowbanks, or even impersonating guards. Each story carried a lesson. Some ended in brutal death, others in temporary triumph. The fortress was relentless, adapting to every attempt, teaching through pain and fear that no one could truly escape its grasp. Even guards spoke in hushed tones of prisoners who seemed almost untouchable, men whose courage and intelligence made them legendary. Yet in the end, the fortress demanded payment. Names disappeared from memory, faces were erased by frost, and the world above carried on unaware of the silent struggle beneath. The frozen fortress thrived on fear. Punishments were not only a tool of discipline, but an instrument of psychological terror. Men were chained in ice chambers, left to endure temperatures that numbed limbs and froze flesh. The cold became a silent torturer, working alongside guards to crush spirit and hope. Prisoners learned quickly that defiance was a luxury they could not afford. The fortress had a way of observing them beyond sight and sound, as though the very walls judged intent. Whispers of previous prisoners haunted the halls, and shadows seemed to move with purpose. Any sign of disobedience triggered swift retribution. Solitary confinement was worse than death. In cells where light never touched the stone, prisoners became lost to time. Days and nights blurred. The mind began to invent enemies, friends, and escape plans that did not exist. Guards occasionally checked on these cells, but their presence was a reminder that escape was impossible. Hunger, frostbite, and despair worked in tandem to wear down even the strongest. The fortress's punishment extended beyond physical suffering. Men were forced to watch others endure unimaginable torment, their cries echoing through halls. The sound was designed to break the soul, leaving a permanent imprint of fear. Those who survived punishment became wary ghosts, moving silently, speaking only when necessary, and constantly calculating the invisible rules of survival. Yet in this cruelty, small sparks of resistance persisted. Prisoners whispered to each other, carved messages in hidden corners, and shared fleeting moments of warmth. Fear was constant, but courage lingered, a fragile flame battling the cold machinery of oppression. The ice cells were the most feared part of the fortress. Carved directly into the frozen stone, they were narrow, dimly lit, and impossibly cold. Frost clung to the walls and formed jagged spikes that seemed to reach for the prisoner's flesh. Breathing was a labor, each inhalation freezing instantly in the lungs. Guards rarely visited except to deliver punishment, yet the cells themselves seemed alive, observing and punishing in silence. Prisoners were left here for days or weeks with nothing but the sound of their own heartbeat and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Time was meaningless, measured only by the slow erosion of their bodies. Some men clawed at the walls, trying to chip away frost or create marks that proved they had been alive. But the ice swallowed every trace. The mind became a labyrinth, echoing with the cries of those who had come before, each scream a lesson etched into memory. Despite the terror, acts of defiance persisted. Some prisoners whispered stories to the walls as if the ice itself could remember and keep their words alive. Messages were carved with fingernails into frost-covered stones, tiny acts of rebellion that demanded courage beyond comprehension. Prisoners learned to communicate through subtle taps, frozen scratches, or whispers carried by frost-laden air. These small acts reminded them they still existed, that the fortress could not erase every soul. The ice cells became a crucible, separating the broken from the unbroken. Men who survived them gained an almost supernatural resilience. Their bodies were battered and frozen, but their minds had learned to endure the impossible. Legends circulated among prisoners of those who spent months in the ice and returned to the barracks with eyes blazing, silent warnings to the guards and inspiration to their peers. The ice cells were more than punishment. They were a message. The fortress spoke through cold silence and fear. The lessons of endurance became part of its legacy, shaping every man who walked its halls. Those who could withstand the ice emerged changed, carrying a quiet strength that no guard could touch. And yet the fortress had ensured that the cost of survival would never be forgotten. Some prisoners were more feared than the fortress itself. Men who had challenged tyrants, escaped capture, or led rebellions were brought here, and their reputations preceded them. The guards treated them with a mixture of fear and fascination, knowing that ordinary punishment would not be enough. These men became legends, living examples of defiance that haunted both captors and peers. The dangerous ones carried an aura of inevitability. Their movements were calculated, their minds sharp even in the harshest conditions. They whispered strategies to fellow prisoners, offering hope where none existed. Guards attempted to break them with isolation, frost, and relentless intimidation. Yet many remained untouchable in spirit. Their stories spread quickly, inspiring silent reverence and quiet terror throughout the fortress. Attempts to escape were common among these prisoners. Secret tunnels were dug, weak points in the walls were tested, and guards' patterns observed with meticulous patience. Most plans failed, and failure carried punishment worse than death. Yet some succeeded in minor victories, stealing food, smuggling notes, or orchestrating acts of defiance. These small triumphs reminded everyone that the fortress was formidable but not infallible. The dangerous prisoners were studied carefully. Guards documented behavior, noting those who refused to yield under extreme conditions. Experiments in endurance, isolation, and psychological manipulation were performed, each designed to determine the limits of human resistance. Many subjects survived these tests, emerging with minds sharper, fiercer, and more cunning than ever. In the eyes of the fortress, the dangerous ones were not victims. They were anomalies. Their survival challenged the power of the structure itself, proving that even the most perfected system of fear could not erase the human will entirely. These men became the living proof that courage, intellect, and defiance were forces the frozen fortress could not fully control. Punishment in the frozen fortress went beyond physical pain. Guards used psychological terror to crush the spirit before the body failed. Prisoners were made to witness horrors designed to instill helplessness. Some were forced to endure frostbite while chained to metal posts, their screams echoing through corridors. Others were placed in solitary chambers with complete darkness where time stretched endlessly and reality blurred. Starvation was deliberate and methodical. Meals were meager and irregular, enough to keep men alive but too little to sustain strength. Guards watched as the body weakened, savoring the slow erosion of willpower. Humiliation was frequent. Prisoners were stripped, mocked, and forced into degrading acts, reinforcing the fortress's dominance and eroding identity. Some punishments were experimental. Men were locked in shifting ice cells where temperature fluctuated unpredictably, pushing them to the brink of hypothermia. Sleep deprivation became a weapon. Hours turned into days with no relief. Psychological torment paired with physical suffering created a cocktail of terror that few could endure. Despite this, resilience emerged in hidden pockets. Prisoners found ways to comfort one another in whispers, sharing memories or stories to preserve sanity. Small acts of solidarity, like sharing a stolen blanket or relaying a whispered warning, became lifelines. The fortress demanded submission, but the human spirit refused to surrender completely. The severity of punishment was not arbitrary. It served as a mechanism to demonstrate absolute power. Each act reinforced the fortress's control and reminded prisoners that survival was contingent not on strength alone, but on cunning, endurance, and patience. Every scar, frostbite, and fractured spirit became part of the prison's living history, a record of what men could endure and the cost of resistance. Among the prisoners, one man became a legend for his audacity. He was known only as the Clockwork Prisoner, a nickname earned for his meticulous planning and almost mechanical precision in movement. Unlike others, he studied the fortress, memorized guard rotations, mapped hidden passages, and calculated survival strategies down to seconds. Escape was considered impossible. Guards boasted that the fortress had never lost a prisoner. Yet this man refused to accept fate. He moved silently through the shadows, communicating with other prisoners when necessary, leaving no trace. Days of preparation culminated in a night so silent that even the wind seemed to pause. He bypassed ice cells, avoided patrols, and exploited weaknesses in the fortress design. The walls that had imprisoned men for decades became his guide, their secrets learned through careful observation. He understood the fortress as a living entity, a machine of fear that could be manipulated with patience and intellect. When he finally emerged beyond the gates, the wind hit him like freedom itself. The fortress had claimed countless lives, but he had cheated time and terror, proving that even the most impenetrable system could be outwitted. Stories of his escape spread quietly among prisoners and guards alike, a whisper of hope that became legend. His success was not just a feat of survival, but a challenge to the fortress's myth of absolute control. The Clockwork Prisoner proved that the human mind, when disciplined and clever, could overcome even the harshest imprisonment. His escape became a symbol of defiance and a reminder that even frozen walls could not hold a determined spirit forever. The fortress had eyes everywhere, but not all were human. Frozen statues, twisted shadows, and silent corridors became the witnesses to every act of cruelty. Each prisoner who suffered added to the weight of history pressed into the stone walls. Whispers and echoes seemed to linger long after guards had gone, as if the fortress itself remembered the pain inflicted within its halls. Guards often spoke of strange occurrences. Footsteps when no one walked, faint murmurs carried on icy drafts, and fleeting shapes glimpsed from the corner of the eye. Prisoners claimed to hear the groan of chains long broken, the sigh of men who had succumbed to frost, and the low hum of fear that permeated the corridors. Many dismissed it as madness, yet those who spent months inside could swear the fortress was alive. The silent witnesses were not just spirits, but marks of endurance. Every scar carved into stone, every footprint frozen into the ground became a record of resistance. Prisoners who survived learned to navigate by these markers, interpreting faint scratches and indentations as guides through darkness. They were lessons etched by those who had come before, a hidden map of defiance against an unforgiving system. Even the guards respected these silent witnesses. They avoided certain corridors after nightfall, citing unease that no rational explanation could resolve. Some whispered that the fortress punished indiscriminately, that it claimed the guilty and innocent alike through the subtle pull of its presence. Others believed the very walls had absorbed the souls of those who had endured the worst, and that their silent testimony served as both warning and remembrance. The fortress, in this way, became more than a prison. It became a chronicle of suffering and resilience, a place where memory outlasted tyranny. Every breath of frozen air carried the legacy of countless men and women, a history of fear and courage intertwined. The silent witnesses were never seen directly, yet they were felt by all who entered, shaping every step, every decision, and every flicker of hope. In this section of the fortress, one learned a truth harsher than any punishment. Survival was never guaranteed, but memory endured. And memory was perhaps the most powerful weapon of all, waiting silently for someone to notice, someone to understand, someone to carry it beyond the ice and darkness. The cells were carved from the very bedrock of the mountain, their walls coated in frost and despair. Prisoners were left in cramped spaces where even breathing felt like an act of defiance. The cold seeped into bone and spirit, claiming hope before hunger or pain could. Each night the wind howled through narrow slits in the stone, carrying whispers of past suffering. Despite the merciless environment, prisoners learned small acts of survival. Sharing a blanket, hiding scraps of food, or forming silent alliances became lifelines. The icebound cells demanded endurance, teaching that resistance was more subtle than rebellion. Every shiver, every ache became a testament to human resilience, a quiet rebellion against the fortress that sought to erase them. The guards rarely interfered, trusting the cold and isolation to break even the strongest. They did not account for ingenuity. Prisoners discovered hidden niches, insulated corners, and even old tunnels that allowed brief moments of escape from the oppressive frost. These acts went unnoticed, yet each small victory against the elements or the fortress itself nurtured a flicker of hope. The cells were silent, yet they spoke. Marks on walls, worn stones, and faint scratches told stories of fear, courage, and survival. The icebound cells became a repository of human memory, a place where suffering and endurance intertwined. Even those who perished left traces, whispers frozen into time, waiting for someone to notice, someone to understand, someone to remember. Rising above the fortress was the watchtower, a place of unyielding observation. Guards stationed there saw everything, yet the cold and isolation shaped their minds as brutally as the prison below shaped its captives. From its heights they monitored movements, calculated punishments, and enforced obedience with a mere gesture. The tower was more than a vantage point. It was a psychological weapon. Prisoners knew that their every action was scrutinized, every sound potentially reported. Fear traveled as quickly as the wind, infecting the fortress with uncertainty. Yet paradoxically, the watchtower inspired ingenuity. Prisoners adapted their movements, communicated silently, and found ways to subvert even the omnipresent gaze. The frozen air at that height was thin, carrying both clarity and dread. From the watchtower, one could see the sprawling expanse of the fortress, the icy cells, and the harsh terrain surrounding it. But even here, the cold preserved secrets. Hidden tunnels, silent protests, and fleeting acts of rebellion escaped notice. The watchtower also served as a mirror of human psychology. Guards and prisoners alike were shaped by observation and exposure. The line between oppressor and oppressed blurred in the biting cold. Memory became survival, and survival required adapting to constant scrutiny, learning the patterns of fear and exploiting the rare gaps left by the human frailty of those who watched. Few survived the fortress, and fewer still dared to dream of escape. Yet one man, known only in whispers as the Clockwork prisoner, defied both time and tyranny. He observed routines, studied the weak points, and calculated every detail with precision. Each movement was deliberate, each pause a measure of patience. The escape began in silence. Guards were distracted by storms that rattled the frozen walls. The prisoner moved through hidden passages, traced from faint markings left by those who had suffered before him. Every step was a battle against frost, fear, and the relentless architecture of oppression. When he emerged beyond the gates, the fortress seemed to sigh as if acknowledging defeat. His body ached, his mind raced, yet he carried with him the collective memory of those who could not escape. The frozen cells, watchtower, and silent witnesses had not been erased. They remained embedded in the walls, marking the story of suffering and resilience. The escape became legend not because it was miraculous, but because it was possible. It reminded those who suffered that even in the coldest, darkest places, ingenuity, patience, and courage could overcome oppression. And in the quiet, the fortress continued to exist, but its fear had been fractured, leaving behind memory, testimony, and a warning that even the most impenetrable prison could not hold the human spirit forever.